You're listening to the Wrigleyville Nation podcast. Season ticket holders and lifelong fans with neighborhood ties discuss Cubs news and neighborhood happenings. Here's your hosts, Jeremy and Pat.
Hello and welcome to the Wrigleyville Nation podcast. This is episode 322 of the podcast. My name is Jeremy Deemer and I'll be your host. And I'm joined as always by my co-host. He's on the road on assignment tonight. How's it going, Pat?
I am high atop San Francisco. I can see Coit Tower directly out my window. And, when the Cubs made the big trade yesterday, I knew that they were serious about being a playoff contender. So I jumped on the first plane out here to watch this Giants Diamondback series to get us a little bit of scouting report for future podcasts. But I'm happy to be here.
Excellent. Glad you could make it, and I'm also glad our guest could make it because he brings all of his fantastic baseball knowledge. You know him from his writing, and on his site, we'll let him plug it and tell you all about it, and of course his many, many appearances here on this podcast. Longtime friend of the show, Matt Trueblood, is back. Matt, thanks for taking time out to talk Cubs and trade deadline with us.
Of course. One of my favorite times of year.
Remind our listeners where, at the top of the show, where they can read all of your content about the trade deadline, and we're going to dig into it a little bit for the audio version here.
Yes, good branding. I got to get better at that. Northsidebaseball.com. We've just sort of relaunched the site, which goes back decades as just a Cubs fan community. We relaunched it right around opening day, and these last few days have really seen an upsurge, a lot of people getting involved. We got some new writers over there in addition to my stuff. So yeah, swing by, check it out.
Excellent. And let's get into it here. The Cubs, since last we podcasted, we were on the fence of whether they were going to be buyers or sellers. We were, of course...
We and they both, I think, actually, Jeremy.
Absolutely. And we were pulling for the Cubs to be buyers as the weakness of the division, all signs pointing towards at least making a move, if not a rental player, then at least someone that has control for the next season if you believe you're going to be competitive in the next season. So we wanted to see the Cubs be active, but we were very nervous that they were going to unload Bellinger and Stroman or a combination of one of those two players. But winning 8 in a row, taking 3 of 4 in St. Louis, beating the White Sox in 2 games on the South Side. The Cubs players have forced the hand of the front office to be buyers, and I know that you were as thrilled as I was to see this. My question to you, Pat, before we get into the moves that were made, any thoughts on the 2 series that really forced the hand of the Cubs front office?
Yeah, I mean, you can't really ask for much more than beating the Cardinals 3 in a row after losing that first game so horribly 2 weeks ago, and then coming back strong and beating both the White Sox in back-to-back games, including a game where it looked like you were going to get blown out, and then beating the Cardinals 3 in a row again before losing the Sunday game. I mean, it was he probably took every one of those wins in order for the Cubs to be buyers. I think did Hoyer say in his press conference that the Tauchman catch on Saturday was the deciding factor. That's kind of scary when you think about it, but that's the math right now.
Ryan Herrera from CHGO tweeted out that Cubs president of baseball ops Jed Hoyer noted that the comeback on the South Side and the night of the Mike Tauchman catch in St. Louis as the games that helped determine that the Cubs wouldn't sell. I'd like to hope that Jed had a better plan and a better vision than just like...
No recency bias there, right? But they played 106 games. Like, why those 2?
Yeah, that's a little alarming to hear, but... No, go Matt, go ahead.
I think what he was probably trying to say, how it kind of felt listening to him, was that the comeback on the South Side was the turning point in his thinking. Like, he was heading toward a pivot anyway, but that got him moving in the opposite direction. And then the Tauchman catch was almost an inflection point where now we're sharply headed towards selling and there's really no turning back. I think he just meant it was kind of like a two-jointed turn.
So basically, he was forced to buy because the team kept winning, regardless of his expectations.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, and he did also say that as far as a couple weeks back, the teams he was talking to started sounding skeptical that he was really going to sell, just because they think the Cubs are good or good enough that they were going to be more positioned to buy. So maybe it was, he's also incentivized in a certain way to just roll with the narrative. Yeah, weren't those some great wins and the winning streak and the road trip? That all works nicely. It works as a story. It works in the clubhouse. It works with the fans. He doesn't have to say, I was basically sitting on the fence a long time and I sort of got knocked off. So he's not going to.
So it was absolutely fantastic. Pat and I were together in person to watch the Tuchman catch on Saturday. That was absolutely tremendous. Just a great week for the Cubs and a lot of fun baseball, and glad to see that they were in a position they were within 500. They got to 500. They got over 500. And they beat bad teams, which is something that they had struggled with. I mean, how many of those games against the Washington Nationals did we pencil in as victories? and they just turned
more
out to
than
be
we
tough.
got.
Yeah, boy. Sure. So good to see them beating those bad teams.
Yeah, and it was a very aesthetically pleasing winning streak. There were blowouts, there were comebacks, there were clinging to late leads. It was what you want to see. Even, and I wish that Hoyer had more conviction maybe in the first place, that this team was probably better than it was showing. They might have taken more decisive action sooner if they really believed that. But also the hole they dug for themselves seems really regrettable now, because this is clearly what this team is capable of, not just that streak, but the last month or so. And when you reflect on the fact that it's not like anyone ran away with the division, even the gap that exists, which is manageable and can be caught, and that's why they did what they did at the deadline, it doesn't need to exist. They didn't need to get in this deep and down this bad, but they did. So now that winning streak was only necessary because of how bad they let things get in May, but at least they managed to overcome it.
And I think we're all in agreement that we're glad the Cubs did decide to be buyers rather than sellers this offseason or this trade season. But that doesn't change the fact that they still have a lot of work to do. And I think if you had to be an odds maker, just given where they are statistically and in the standings, et cetera, the odds of the Cubs winning the division are still less than 50% for sure. So, it's something that we think is a valuable exercise. They should make the effort. But I don't want to try to fool people into thinking, well, by doing this, there's any kind of guarantee of success or even the likelihood of success, because it probably, that's not the likelihood really. But that doesn't mean that they shouldn't do it. Like, even if this doesn't work out, even if they fall on their faces and they lose 3 out of 4 to Cincinnati and 2 out of 3 to Atlanta and find themselves 8 games back, 1 week after the deadline, I think it was still worth doing. Because I think it's a chance you have to take. It's a calculated risk. What they gave up, which we can talk about in a few minutes here, doesn't seem like it was so valuable as to really set them back in the future. And, you only, as they say, what was it? Was it Theo? Every year is precious or sacred. And, if you've got a chance to try to compete, do it and see what you can do. And I think that's where, whether it was begrudgingly or unexpectedly, I think that's where Hoyer ended up.
Yeah, definitely begrudgingly, as he sure didn't mind throwing away a couple of years there.
Yes.
So let's talk about it. The trade deadline has come and gone, and the Cubs went out and there were two things we were looking for. We were looking to see some bullpen help, and we were looking for a bat, right? So we see that the Cubs were able to get probably one of the best rental bats you could get. Former Cub making his return, Jeimer Candelario. So Candelario, I remember, Pat, when we had Jason Parks on our podcast very early on in the run of our podcast, and he told
over
us
a decade ago, I think, right?
Yes, I think it was 9 years ago. Yeah, he was on our podcast, and he told us that this is when Chris Bryant was on the roster, that he thought that the best third baseman was in the Cubs system, and it was Candelario. and so no, this was it's great to see them go out and get this guy who first base and third base, both big holes for the Cubs, and he's making his debut tonight against Cincinnati, playing first base. So you can play the matchups, and Bellinger can play first and he can play third, and Tuckman can play in center, or you can have Bellinger in center and have him at first and Madrigal at third. So there's some matchup options now, and he brings a big bat to this lineup, Matt. This is exactly what we were. This is the best you could probably do. That's not Pete Alonso.
Yeah, the best that I think it turned out anybody was willing to trade at a halfway reasonable price. And I think it's especially interesting that he's at first base tonight. We did anticipate, he can slide across and place him first. It's part of a matchup game when the opponent's starting a lefty, all of that stuff. It doesn't really sound like that's the plan. And I can't tell for sure whether that was the plan even when they made the trade, 27 hours ago or whatever, or if it's changed in the short window since then, because what they then decided to do is DFA Trey Mancini. And it sounds like, from everything David Ross said, that while we will see Candelario at third sometimes, he's basically coming in as their first baseman, which is fascinating. Unexpected. You
Yes.
wouldn't have said that at first blush when the deal was made. It's not the line of thinking that any of us were moving along or talking about a week ago when this looked like a distinct possibility. But it's a really interesting approach. I think it says a couple of things. One, they really do like Nick Madrigal, what he brings defensively and what he's gotten to a sufficient place offensively at third base. And two, that I think they realized, if you basically say what Nick Madrigal's doing is not some outrageous hot streak, this is sustainable and it's average or just below average production from the position, then really the place we can most upgrade our roster is suddenly first base, or first base and DH, where there's been a scar all year. So they said, this guy that we're targeting, that we're acquiring, he does mostly play third base. That's mostly where he's played for his career, but he has experience at first. He might plug that hole better. You leave Madrigal alone and you start to squeeze out, obviously and primarily, Mancini, but also the more Seiya Suzuki struggles, or maybe eventually the more regression bites Mike Tauchman, the more you can hide those guys. And now you basically replace the weaker parts of their games with Candelario, and you replace Mancini wholesale with him. They might have found a way to upgrade the roster more by doing that than they would have by just trading for him and slotting him in at third instead of Madrigal. I think that's surprisingly nimble, and I can't tell if it was their intention all along, or if this is something maybe where even the coaching staff really likes Madrigal at third and the defense he brings more than the front office had anticipated. But that's where we are.
Or, I mean, that seems like a very cogent analysis, but maybe Jed Hoyer's playing seven-dimensional chess, and his goal is to drive down Candelario's free agent value for next year by playing him at first as opposed to third, so that we can re-sign him for a cheaper price and save money. Just think about that.
I did. And then I thought, if Jed Hoyer was going to drive down someone's free agent price by playing them at a less valuable position than they're capable of, Cody Bellinger would be at first base every day.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, he'd be DHing probably.
And there'd be reports that his knee's a little sore, and yeah.
No, it is. it's like the circle of life here. I can remember in the off season when Jeremy and I were talking to perhaps you probably and other guests about potential acquisitions before the Cubs went out and got Trey Mancini in that 2-year deal at $7 million a year. Candelario was one of the names that popped up in conversation, and the Cubs decided to go the Mancini route. Obviously, they would prefer, in retrospect, to have done it differently, but at the time, they were taking a chance. They had two guys who had down years, and were taking a chance that Mancini would bounce back, and couldn't have been more wrong, I guess. But I find it interesting that for the first time in a long time, the Cubs were just like, you know what, we'll eat that $7 million for next year, which I think is a good sign. I mean, a healthy sign anyway for a big market team to say, look, we made a mistake. We went out, we tried to get somebody, it just didn't work out. But we're not going to feel like we have this obligation to carry a below replacement level player for 2 full years just because we paid them some money, and that they can afford to absorb $7 million. They don't want to, obviously, but at least you can afford to do it. And it makes your team better from a roster construction standpoint to do it. So good for them.
Yeah. And I mean, I know he's a positive influence in the clubhouse, probably a guy that they'll miss a little bit in the room, but you can only have, there's a limit to how much of that kind of influence you can have when you're having just a career crisis of a season. I mean, when you are as lost as he is, the whatever light, makes you a good leader and a good, guy in the dugout and the clubhouse sort of goes dim. So I think it was surprisingly decisive, not even just about the money, but in situations like these, they tend to let it drag out even more.
For weeks.
Eric Hosmer.
You would have thought this move would have occurred like the 3rd week of August, and they would have like schlepped up Mervis or something, by then, and said, oh, well, we tried with Trey and it didn't work out. But the fact that they were this decisive is interesting. And it does make me wonder. I mean, I don't know, Matt, what your thought is on the whole Mervis situation, but they got a spot for him, I guess, at times if they want to use him, and they still have the DH. And I know Morel moves around, and they can use, they've got a lot of guys who can kind of play different positions and or play certain matchups. Do you think Mervis is somebody who you would see coming back now, or do you think that's a September situation?
It's going to be interesting to watch. I think that one reason why they did what they did is that they were sort of forced into it, just the way they were sort of forced into selling, where I think we kind of don't know what's up with Patrick Wisdom at the moment. There might be an injury, something going on there, but he's certainly been playing better than Mancini. Nick Madrigal's been playing way too well to option him, and you wouldn't want to trade him just because his trade value hasn't crept up enough yet. Chris Morel, I mean, just today on the radio, David Ross basically told Dan Bernstein and Lawrence Holmes, Christopher Morel's my everyday DH. So that wasn't really an option. And I think Ross is also really comfortable having all 3 catchers on the roster and not sending down Miguel Amaya. Now that they've gotten Mancini out of the way, because they were left with really no other choice, if Wisdom does end up needing to spend time on the injured list again, or if he just craters, as he sometimes does, and they decide it's time to move on, or if Madrigal gets hurt, which is always a possibility, or if Amaya continues what's been a bit of a struggle lately because he's not playing very often, and it's just, that's a tough spot, a tough role that they've stuck him into, then they can always sort of call that audible and either option Amaya or shelve one of those guys and then bring up Mervis. There's no rush on it, but the door is open to it. I think that might be one of the upsides they saw in choosing to take out Mancini now, but I wouldn't say it necessarily means we're going to see Mervis any sooner than they otherwise planned.
I do like the possibility of actually having multiple left-handed hitters in the lineup at once, 3 or 4 actually. If you've got Happ and Bellinger and you've got Mervis come up, and then you've got Candelario. I mean, it's nice to see a little bit more versatility than they've had. And Tuckman too, yeah. What about, we talk about like I just mentioned the left-handed hitters, and of course if Tuckman and Bellinger and Mervis and Candelario are all playing at once, that means, one of them could DH, but one of them could also play right field. Like maybe either Tuckman or Bellinger, which might be something you do in certain situations when you are facing certain right-handed pitchers. I don't know. Seiya Suzuki has really struggled this year, and we've talked about this. Last year we talked about it in the off season. It's been frustrating. We talked about his fielding in the past, but right now it's his offense, which is really, he goes into some really big slumps. What do we make of that?
Yeah. I mean, from Ross's comments and envisioning now Candelario as primarily a first baseman, that does almost put Tauchman and Seiya into a right field platoon most of the time, because Ross is also pretty much committed to Morel at DH all the time. I don't think that's really the long-term plan, but it might be the short-term plan. It might be the next 2 weeks plan. And during that time, when Seiya is starting much less often, they might be, whatever it is, if it's cage work, if it's field work, if it's video work. I mean, I think they feel like, and his underlying batted ball data all says this too. There's still a really talented hitter here, and there's no deficiency in the intelligence of his approach or anything. He just is having a really hard time riding the wave of adjustments that happens in this league. I think they are going to try to get him a step back from the action for a little while and see what they can reset or address. And then I would imagine they're hoping that by September, it's back to Seiya's playing pretty close to every day. Now Tauchman's going to get more reps in center. Maybe Candelario starts coming over to third more often, that kind of stuff. But
the other move that the Cubs did was getting a right-handed pitcher for their bullpen. It's Jose Cuas from Kansas City, and Nelson Velasquez goes back the other way. We'll always have the Nelson Velasquez grand slam. He's a guy who just couldn't crack this lineup, and I don't understand why we didn't see more of him.
I think we saw a good chunk of him last year, and I think that's why we didn't see more of him this year, where it's like we saw what happens when you just stick Nelson Velasquez in an outfield spot every day for a month or two. He gets pretty exposed. He swings and misses a lot. He does not even have, he and Morel are natural comps because they sort of came up at the same time last year. It's definitely power over hit, a lot of swing and miss. They're really close, just personally. I think Velasquez was not a good defender, no matter really where you put him. I kept wanting him to be because you could see the tools, but it was not. It was not good. B, he didn't even have what Morel does as sort of a shield when the adjustments are really working against him. He can get more patient and squeeze out a walk now and then and sort of survive and limp by. Velasquez doesn't really even have that. He's a little too aggressive for that to work. And so I still think there's a chance, everything comes together for him at some point, and he's a pretty decent player. But that wasn't even right around the corner. And the big thing was they just needed to clear some roster space. Again, one thing I like, and they were sort of cornered into it, like the last two instances that we talked about of them getting decisive, they were sort of cornered into it because of the timing of the draft and their very well-stocked farm system from these last couple of years of not being decisive, and the rules that now limit how many players you can just keep on reserve in your minor leagues, in season and out of season. They were going to have to move some people. They needed to create playing time for Pete Crow Armstrong in AAA, which might be the most exciting part of this move. It's not to me because I'm a pitching sicko, and we'll get to that in a minute, but it could be, is that they're trading Nelson because they need to get PCA into the everyday center field job in Iowa right now. So they're doing that, and with the deadline coming and a 40-man roster crunch looming, this just made perfect sense. It rebalances everything beautifully. They found a great fit, and you can wish Nelson the best, but the role just was not going to materialize here, especially while your manager insists on carrying 3 catchers and you spent half the year trying to limp along with 2 first basemen at a time. Well, then you run out of position players and you just can't carry that power hitting 4th outfielder type that really is Velasquez's best role.
Now, as with your, I'm going to tap on your Twins expertise here, and I know that you've probably seen more Royals games than I have. My current total is 0, so I have not seen Quas pitch. What are Cubs fans in for with him joining the roster?
Ooh, you can't hear it, but I am rubbing my hands together. Yeah, I have seen Jose Quas pitch against the Twins. You had exactly right how I found him. And dude is not actually good currently, but could be.
He's not. I mean, statistically speaking, he's really not good right now. So what's going to happen to change that?
Here's what I want you to do, though, and it doesn't have to be right now. Go back and look at the numbers Pedro Strop was putting up with the Orioles just before the Cubs traded for him in July 2013. Because we are not far from talking about the same kind of pitcher.
Wow. That's a big comp.
Quas is different. He's later blooming. His story is wild and weird.
He's 29, right? Or something, or no?
Yeah. And at this deadline, the Cubs really set themselves a challenge by only acquiring Dominican guys who spent like half their childhood in the States. Candelario was born in New York and moved down to the Dominican when he was a kid. Quas was born in the Dominican, but spent like his adolescent years in New York and was drafted and came through the system that way. At one point stepped away from baseball, was doing odd jobs. I think like a FedEx driver. You know, the human interest stories that are going to get written are great. They're fine. They're not really the point, but a long journey to this point for him. But the long and short of it, the actual physical baseball part is this is a dude who does not throw that hard, but throws hard enough, 93-ish, from a truly wild angle. It's like straight flat sidearm, but not the bend at the waist and scoop way down to the ground sidearm. That sidearm that's still the body's riding high, which can be the most deceptive way to do it. And up until May of this year, he was just sinker, slider, changeup, which wasn't great. I mean, it was fine. It's everything coming out of that slot is going to be really heavy. You know, the sinker was a very heavy pitch. There was some virtue to it, but it was not working especially well. And then he picked up a 4-seamer. And the thing, it doesn't have like crazy rising action for your average 4-seam fastball, but for a 4-seam fastball that comes from that slot, the way he throws it, it has crazy life. And that is what the Cubs like about this. He comes from way over on the third base side of the rubber, so right-handed batters feel like he's throwing his fastball right at him, and it still lands in the zone. I think they'll try to tweak his slider a little. I think they'll work on getting him more comfortable with the 4-seamer so he can hit the zone with it a little more. But there is legitimate, like Pedro Strop style upside to this dude. It's fastball, slider, a change that will come and go, but ultimately he could be extremely effective with a couple of tweaks, a couple of, we've already seen you make this change. Now let's get you a little more eased into it, or here's how we do things. By the way, if you want to, just like with the Orioles 10 years ago, if you want to acquire a player and bet on them improving, acquire a player from the Royals. Like, they're terrible at this stuff.
So
they don't know what they're doing.
Can they not afford a pitching coach? Is that the problem, or what's it?
I mean,
what is it?
They just cleaned out their front office at the end of last year. They finally fired their long maligned pitching coach, who was Cal Eldred from way back in the 90s.
Sure.
And
he's a good immaculate grid answer, by the way.
it's true.
Yeah.
He's not a good pitching coach, though. But the thing is, they didn't hire a good one in his place either. They fixed basically none of their problems as an organization.
I mean, they only pay
news-
$12.50 an hour, so I can see why it's hard to get people.
It might be the problem. So, yeah, I mean, go shopping on the Royals, and that's what they did. I don't know if they even necessarily set out to do that. You have a target or two in each org for different kinds of deals, and the timing just really worked with needing to move Nelson at this point. But yeah, I think you're right. Pedro is a very lofty comp, and part of it is just there's a little charm to. They brought in a late blooming, charismatic kind of Dominican dude. Pedro had the hats to the left. This guy wears his hat to the right.
That balances it out.
Yeah, right. It's nice. But I am irrationally excited, and when he inevitably fails, I will be irrationally saddened by it. But I really like the move and do think there's upside to it, especially given that the guy they were trading away had no utility left for the Cubs organization.
Can you explain how the Cubs got fleeced in this Tampa Bay trade, which I assume he did? Is Manny Rodriguez going to lead the American League in saves next year? What's going on here? And what was I get this seems like another roster crunch situation organizationally, as opposed to just at the major league level. But what's your take? I always get a little nervous when the Cubs make trades with teams that are just sort of like the Royals fans must feel that way whenever they make a trade. But for the Cubs, there are certain teams where when you make a trade with them, you hold your breath a little.
With Tampa Bay, no, yeah, you whenever they're calling, whenever they're they're always a step ahead of you when you're trying to make this trade. I definitely feel like anytime you're dealing with them, you're losing this trade.
Yeah, I do think that Manny Rodriguez is going to figure out something in that org. Maybe it's only for 2 months or something. They're not awesome at keeping guys healthy once they've turned them into some kind of monster. But yeah, there is that potential. I also think you're right. They needed to do some roster clearing, and this helped because they traded Rodriguez and Adrian Sampson. They had to send along some international slot money, the right to spend money really to the Rays. So that's kind of a lot you gave up. Part of the motivation is moving the money they owed to Adrian Sampson, because I don't remember how much it was, but they tendered him a contract last year. So he's on a guaranteed deal, even though he hasn't been in the majors and was just outrighted off the 40-man. They still owe him that money. Now they don't. So this helps them accommodate getting Candelario without threatening to go over the luxury tax threshold. That's an important part. Getting 2 players out of the org and only pulling 1 back in is important. I also think they kind of did want this guy that they got back, Josh Roberson, who's my old colleague at Baseball Prospectus, Jeffrey Paternostro, our prospect guy, would say he just threw all these guys into a bucket, 95 and a slider. Because every reliever who comes up through the minors, there are dozens of them, maybe hundreds. 95 and a slider. And unless the slider's something special or the 95 has a lot of life, it's just not, that's the standard package. Well, Roberson's 97 and a slider. And the slider picked up much better command after he went on the development list for a little bit this spring. So, yeah, I think there's something they kind of like there. So you can even, convince yourself that you might see Roberson. I don't think any of these guys are impact pieces. It's more about moving some money and moving some personnel so that the Cubs can achieve their long-term goals. But not a bad move. It's just that, Manny Rodriguez is going to close out the American League Championship Series this season. So
I do have to say that the Adrian Sampson, for the short time he spent as a Cub in those 2 years, he ended up, he pitched 139 innings for the Cubs, and he had an ERA plus of 139 and an ERA of 3.03. So, I mean,
some bad teams.
He did his job, I guess, for 2 years with the Cubs. It just, it's one of those heads. We warned people about this coming into this season, which is we were never going to recoup his 19 games started last year and 3.11 ERA. That was going to be very hard to replace, and we saw with Tayon and others, it's just that whatever July, August, September starts Sampson had last year were good ones for him, and they were going to have to make that up somehow elsewhere, because that's too much probably to ask for somebody. But he just and then this year he never actually made it to the major league team, did he?
No. Yeah. And I'm not sure they ever even planned for him to after a certain point.
Yeah.
He was more emergency depth this year, but that was
smoke
by design.
and mirrors, I guess. Is that the theory for him?
What'd you say?
Is it like a smoke and mirrors thing? I mean, he outperformed his abilities for 100 innings here or there, but wasn't somebody they could rely on in their mind for real. Or
he doesn't throw hard, and he doesn't have special command, and he doesn't have special movement. Someone on Twitter today just called him a kitchen sink guy, and I really think that's about what it is. It's 5 or 6 pitches and some competitiveness, and when he was commanding his sinker, then he could have some good starts. He definitely was a serviceable innings eater, but yeah, when you're aiming even as high as they were aiming coming into this season to be respectable and in the position they're in right now come July, you only want that guy as emergency depth, not as your 5th or 6th starter, which is where he ended up in 2022 and even part of 2021.
Let's talk about the trades that didn't happen.
Well, before we do that, can we just real quick, just to close the door on these trades, we never really got into the return for Candelario. Did you have any heartburn over the Kevin Made, DJ Hertz return from the Cubs?
None, and I don't mean that as a slight to those guys, but
it's fair. That's a fine, fair trade, right?
I mean, I've heard the Cubs have one of the top farm systems in all of baseball, and they were both top 20 prospects for the Cubs. But then when I saw the trade, a lot of people were sort of, well, they're not really that good. They've got a lot of question marks. They're not whatever. Although I did go back just for fun, and I Googled them, and I found some very, very friendly, positive feedback from prospect people about those very 2 people that was as old as a month ago. But, that's how that works, right? Like, once they're gone, we come up with reasons why we didn't like them. It did seem like there was some redundancy, at least for Made, and it wasn't like they were going to be on the major league roster anytime soon. But if I had a dollar for every DJ Hertz story I've read over the last couple of years, I think I'd be able to go out for a nice steak dinner. What's your take on those guys?
Yeah. Well, okay. Start with Hertz. I think. Or hers, it doesn't matter.
Hers, yeah.
It certainly doesn't matter now, right?
No, in fact, we can call whatever we want. In fact, we have that right now.
I was probably a lot less convicted on him than his biggest fans were, even 2 years ago. Last year, some of the cracks started to show where he's got good stuff and some funk in the delivery, and all that starts to get you excited. Relatively low in the minors when it's coming
in A ball. He could struck out everyone in A ball.
Right. But part of that is being a big lefty who throws a little weird and just has overpowering stuff. He does not have very good command. I don't love his chances of staying healthy for the long run. And to then flip to Made, it's sort of, it's obviously very different. He's a hit overpower, not even that much hit. Mostly it's the glove shortstop. Couldn't be more different from a big strapping left-handed pitcher, except it's kind of the same story where that profile looks really interesting and you can dream a lot on it. You can add things to it in your mind and call it projection when they're in low A. When it's been 2 more years and they haven't even escaped high A, and now, Made's hitting 220 and, the glove is still there, and You could see them getting a little stronger, and you can tell yourself a story. But I think I was never quite as excited on guys like that as some people were. And I think they clearly peaked in their prospect value like a year ago. I guess then you could make a case that the Cubs are a little late in dealing them, but I actually think getting the top rental bat on the market for just these two guys who maybe are still top 20 in the system, but if they are, especially after adding in this draft class, they're definitely not top 15. It's like way down at the bottom of the top 20. That's where these guys rested. You just can't afford to hug too tightly to those. And the whole league is hugging too tightly to prospects anyway. You definitely don't want to be hugging too tightly to ones who are that far down the hierarchy, even within one organization.
Let's talk about the trades that weren't made. And the Cubs were unable to land a lefty bullpen arm that I know we were watching for. I was rooting for Andrew Chafin as the deadline rolled on, but unfortunately the Brewers lock in Chafin. Matt, what were your thoughts on that? Were you hoping that the Cubs were going to make a move, get one more lefty bullpen arm?
Yeah, or one more reliable sort of high leverage arm either side. I was interested in Chafin when that rumor came up, but I'll circle back to that in a second. Interested certainly in Aaron Bummer, maybe slightly less than some others because I wasn't super high on Bummer, but that was a good just fit. Very interested in, even though the cost would have been much higher, a guy like Paul Sewell, who ended up going from Seattle to Arizona, or David Bednar, who kept coming up in rumors, and who I know they did sort of stay interested in. That was not a fake rumor or anything, but ultimately that would have been a tough trade to make within the division. I was hopeful they would add more depth that way because I think the bullpen is thin. But I think some of the other bullpen moves, or the bullpen guys who just didn't move, period, including Bummer, including Brooks Raley and Adam Ottavino with the Mets, including a handful of guys around the league who either didn't move or moved at the very last second, sort of tells you that prices were pretty high. And we knew that. We knew it was a seller's market, especially for relievers, because there are so few sellers this year that supply was artificially constricted and demand was really high, because demand's always going to be high for relievers. Now, if you add an extra couple of buyers, take away a couple of sellers, it can get downright frantic. So I'm not shocked that it didn't happen. I was hopeful that it would. When the Chafin rumor came up, it was very strange because Chafin has been pitching for the Diamondbacks, who are like a game and a half or 2 games ahead of the Cubs in the wild card standings. It made more sense once they actually traded him to the Brewers for Peter Strzelecki, who's going to go right into their bullpen as a righty. They wanted to do some rebalancing and get more team control, but have a maybe slightly lower leverage, lower talent piece, but a guy who's controllable for the long term and fits into their reshaped bullpen hierarchy under Sewell, who they just acquired. They weren't looking to trade Chafin for a prospect or someone they couldn't use right away. So the Cubs, in hindsight, were never that great a fit, because I don't know what the Cubs were going to give them that I wouldn't say, well, great, you got Chafin, but we kind of needed that guy too. Yep. Whereas the Brewers could afford to give up Strzelecki. So,
have you noticed a pattern with the Brewers? I mean, first it was Matt Stairs, then Vogelbach, and now Chafin. They really do seem to gravitate towards the larger Cubs.
Yeah, and just the more you resemble Bernie Brewer himself,
yeah, exactly.
No more kidding, eagerly right? They're going to pursue you if you stick around the majors long enough.
Yeah, the real story is that someone from the Mets wasn't traded. That's even more surprising. There's big blockbusters happening constantly. The Mets unloading everybody, and one of the pieces that we talked about weeks ago on this podcast, Pat. Weeks ago, we said, boy, when we were fantasizing about what the trade deadline would look like, we said, boy, wouldn't it be great if the Cubs could weaponize some of the extra money they've got coming off the books next year, and they can go and make a move and try to pry a Pete Alonso out from the Mets, and that seemed like that wasn't even like being talked about a lot, and then all of a sudden it heated up today, like we were seeing, oh, Pete Alonso's been being talked to all week, and it's like, oh wow, this is this could be a thing, and then didn't happen, didn't end up being traded, but I got excited for a little bit there that we might have been right in our analysis again. But man, if only someone was able to pry, and that someone being the Cubs was able to pry Alonso away from the Mets. That's something I was really hoping for as that unfolded.
Yeah, that would have been incredible. And it was so weird that apparently it was a possibility for a little while. And especially, I mean, we found out because Max Scherzer just decided to talk to Ken Rosenthal for a bit, right? That the Mets are taking a step back in 2024, looking to 2025 and beyond. So clearly this had to be something that was in play for several days at the least. But we didn't really find out it was in play until like an hour and a half before the deadline. And I guess that's good, because then I didn't spend 2 days going,
Make
Alonso, though. Yeah. Alonso. It's all got to be Alonso. I only spent an hour doing that. But, yeah, it would have been an incredible fit. It would have cost something that really hurt. And I guess the good news is, if all that is true, and boy, it sure seems like it has to be, just based that they committed themselves to that strategy now, if it wasn't true before, then you can probably talk to the Mets about Alonso again come the offseason. But doesn't.
It would have been a real game changer, though, for the stretch drive, I think. I mean, if you're the Cubs, if you really wanted to set yourself apart from the Brewers and the Reds, apart from just feeling like you're better in general, that sure would, between that and Candelario, that would have been a strong move, or series of moves, I guess.
Yeah, but probably more than the front office was willing to, roll the dice on this year's team. Obviously, Alonso's an acquisition for beyond that, but you would be throwing a lot of chips into the pot for this year. And I think what we found out ultimately was they weren't that interested in doing that with this team. They were kind of in the same place they ended up, although it was the opposite direction of the momentum heading into the deadline. But in 2015, they were slumping going into the deadline, and the front office just sort of shrugged and traded for Dan Herron. That was the most they were willing to do. Right. This year, it was the opposite, sweeping in from being sellers to now they're buyers because they're playing so well, but ultimately kind of the same spot, just barely over 500, lagging the leaders in the division. And they wanted to make a gesture toward buying, but I don't think they were willing to ultimately break the bank unless it was going to be, unless the price turned out to be right on someone like Bednar or like Logan Gilbert, who they could control for another 2 or 3 years, without emptying out the top tier of the farm system.
In an alternate universe where Tauchman doesn't make that catch on Saturday, and where the White Sox aren't just terribly pathetic, and the Cubs were sellers at the, just the other edge of that, and of where they are now, and they made the decision to sell. What do you think the Cubs would have gotten for Cody Bellinger this year, as now that you've seen everything unfold?
Well, we can work our way up from what they gave up for Candelario, but I do think it would have been quite a bit more than that, I guess. At this point, it's hard to even unwind things, because I think some of the top pieces we saw traded, which ended up being the guys that the Astros and the Rangers gave to the Mets in deals where the Mets paid down Max Scherzer and Justin Verlander big time into like normal baseball player salaries. Those kinds of prospects were maybe slightly out of reach, for Bellinger, but that tier was not out of reach for Bellinger the way he was playing if they'd had to sell. But I think it's also a little trickier because you're not going to have as expansive a market for a rental as you do for a guy who's controlled into the following season. You're not going to have as expansive a market for a position player as for a pitcher, although Cody kind of pushed back against that. I would work through different teams and I'd sort of expect to run into a wall with them where, well, they have a good center fielder, but they don't have a good first baseman, or they have a good first baseman, but not a good center fielder, or what they really need is someone to hit lefties. But you know what? Cody's hitting lefties really well this year. So,
and the Cubs could pay every penny of that salary if there was a team that had a luxury tax issue or, was just cheap.
Yeah. I think however you line up the top tier of the Cubs farm system, it's PCA, James Triantos, Cade Horton, Jordan Wicks, Ben Brown, Kevin Alcantara, that kind of top six. You probably could have acquired someone for Bellinger who fit into the bottom half or bottom third of that group. So it's a really good prospect. It's not going to displace any of the guys you like very best in there. But someone like that, and then a secondary piece who's either, this year's Zach McKinstry or a lottery ticket from the Dominican Summer League. And you sort of take your pick, or your trade partner does. So it would have been a good return, but ultimately the potential of contending this year and going forward with this team as is probably more valuable and certainly more fun than that return was going to be anyway. It wasn't going to be something that made us gasp and go, oh yeah, you couldn't have turned this down. That deal just wasn't out there.
It's interesting to think about what the Mets did at this trade deadline and how it could impact next year's trade deadline. As you mentioned, Matt, people are holding on tight to those top prospects. They weren't giving them up during this trade deadline. But the Mets found a way to pry out some of the best prospects, and that was by buying them. Basically, they ended up footing the bill for a lot of these contracts, and basically you're buying prospects now by doing a strategy like that, where you can use your money to pry those higher tier prospects away. I'm interested to see if that changes some behavior of some of the big market teams next season.
Yeah, I'm going to be watching that too, and I don't know, the league might start looking for ways to curb that behavior or that opportunity.
I mean, they always do, right? They did it with the draft. They did it with the international free agency.
Exactly.
They always find ways. Even with, the Cubs are always like a day late and a dollar short. Like with the minor leagues now, they shrink the size of the minor leagues now too. And just when the Cubs have a bunch of people they want to keep in the minors, it's frustrating to watch the league react to the various strategies like that.
Yeah, although this one, and I don't know how you would legislate against it. I don't feel like it necessarily needs to be legislated against because
it's currently just Steve Cohen, but
right. It's just one person you'd be fighting, and it's really not like even Steve Cohen's not going to do this on the regular. He didn't sign Scherzer and Verlander. I mean, you can tell in the structure of those contracts, he did not sign them anticipating that he'd be trading either one. Like they had to do some serious and strange gymnastics. Like, if Verlander's vesting option for 25 does vest, we'll give you half of its value, which is another $17.5 million. The Astros now get to decide by whether or not they push Justin Verlander past 140 innings next year, whether Steve Cohen owes them another $17 million. The man did not set out to do this, and no one's going to set out to do this anytime soon. I don't want to even really applaud it because I think it's sort of gross the way Cohen is getting to just throw some of this money around. But good on the baseball side, at least, for understanding that we have the advantage of our owner being willing to spend a bottomless amount of money. Let's use that to buy really good prospects who can't be bought in any other way. You can't just use money to acquire players this young and good in any other facet, because the caps are so much harder now in the international space and in the draft. You're sort of stuck, except in unique cases like this. So good on them for being creative. Hopefully it's not something that becomes a trend, because it will quickly feel slimy and weird. But I almost can't imagine it becoming a trend either. If you sign players as good as Scherzer and Verlander on a regular basis, you're going to be good much more often than you're bad. And if you're good, you're not going to be looking to trade them. So,
all right, let's look ahead to the week that will be for the Cubs. Pat, we did pretty well on predictions last week.
Yeah, we thought the Cubs would go 4-2, and they ended up 5-1. I thought it was going to go over his off the tip of his glove. I really did, and that was really the difference in the predictions. But otherwise, I think we were spot on, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We did tremendous, and now we look ahead to this week. Again, the crucial series against the Reds. Cubs lose the first one. They are dominating in Game 2 as of the time of this recording. And then, so they've got two more with Cincinnati before 3 at home against the Braves to end the homestand. And then 3 at the Mets. Now the Mets are terrible, so that's a good news. But then 3 at the Blue Jays, and the Blue Jays are now the Cardinals. As they got a lot of Cardinals players to add to their already good team.
Well, I predict the Cubs will be at least 1-1 to start the week, and then from there, and I fully bet that this Game 2 is still in progress. It's not even an official game yet. It's like top of the 5th, but I think the Cubs will pull it out. So this is one of those weeks where the Cubs play 7 games. Like you said, 4 against the Reds, 3 against the Braves, and you don't have to be dominant every week. You just have to tread water in some weeks. And this seems to me like more of a tread water week than it is a dominate week. I mean, maybe it'll dominate the teams, but if you went 4-3 against those 2 teams, I think you'd consider it a very successful week. And if you went 3-4, it wouldn't really I don't think it should give you pause that the season's over, that you can't come back. But I think that's where they're probably going to be around. The Braves are a very good team, and
they are. Yeah.
Now all the games are at home, so I'm predicting a 4-3 week, but I could see it go the other way too. Let's just hope it's not lopsided against them, because the Cubs definitely cannot afford to lose 3 out of 4 to the Reds for a couple of reasons. One, you don't want to fall 2 games behind the Reds further than you were when you started the series, but also that would clinch the season series for the Reds, which would in essence mean the Cubs are yet another game behind, because they would actually have to finish the season 1 game ahead of the Reds in order to win the division in the head-to-head. They don't do the single game playoffs anymore. They just go by head-to-head record. So,
right.
Yeah. For me, I see this as a split against the Reds. I see this they'll go 2-2, and then 1-3 against the Braves. So I think this is a.
They only played the Braves 1 out of 3, or they only played them 3 times, don't they?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So you see them going 3-4. That's discouraging.
3-4. That's my prediction for the week.
Well, Matt? I guess Matt's a tiebreaker.
I'll go with Pat. I'm gonna say 4-3. Partially just because they need to.
They do.
Exactly.
They do. Yes.
Yeah. But
necessity is the mother of ingenuity, or something. I don't know. Something like that.
I will say, and boy, it's a strange thing to be even mildly impressed by, but this past week, David Bell signed an extension as the Reds manager because they're having a great year. You can also see the little ways he's earned it. Like tonight, it's 13-2 at my current check. Maybe it's changed even again. But it's 13-2 Cubs. The Reds still have their starter, Ben Lively, in the game.
Because they hate him.
Because they are not going to let the Cubs bully them into emptying out their bullpen when they really had to use a lot of their bullpen last night to cling to that 1-run win.
Well, his parents disagree with
him. Obliterated here with 2 more games to go in the series. So
good call. Yeah.
David Bell, annoyingly smart, but I think the Cubs still I'll say pull out these next two in addition to tonight.
Yeah.
And then, lose 2 or 3 to the Braves, but it's still a 4-3 week, and you close the gap by beating the Reds 3 out of 4.
Absolutely. And you save yourself. They still have that one final 4-game series with the Reds because of the postponed game.
Mm-hmm.
But you really don't want to lose the season series. I mean, to either the Brewers or the Reds, frankly, because it could be that tight down the stretch, I think.
Yeah, and it'll just be it'll be so annoying if they lose the division. And, by the way, they could lose the division and miss the playoffs altogether without the right to even play for it, when you play to a tie. So, let's avoid that scenario or inflict that scenario on one of the other fan bases, because I will hate it if that happens. I just
good news.
Ties should be settled on the field. That's how baseball is supposed to work.
We do have good
news.
Oh,
do we?
Yeah.
You first. No, I want the good news.
The good news is, after that Blue Jays series, the schedule gets incredibly easy for 2 full weeks.
It's very AL Central-ish, doesn't it?
Boy, that AL Central, yeah. You get there's 2 against the White Sox, 3 against the Royals, 3 at the Detroit Tigers before playing 4 at Pittsburgh. And then you get to play the Milwaukee Brewers to close out the month of August. So this is a tough stretch here, but it'll be followed up by 2 weeks of pretty easy games.
And all those teams you just listed, that soft stretch of the schedule, just emptied themselves out today.
Yes.
I mean,
they all sold.
Parades out of town. So, take advantage.
So, by the end of this week, Sunday afternoon, the Cubs will have played 23 games since the All-Star break. Of those 23 games, 17 will have been played at home, 2 on the south side, playing the White Sox, and 4 in St. Louis. I don't know exactly what to make of it, but it feels like that's the kind of stretch where if you can go 3, if you count the All-Star break, really 4 weeks without having to really travel, that's got to be a nice thing going into the dog days of August, right?
Yeah. Hopefully it means they're rested and able to, make hay the rest of the month. That's I mean, I know we all remember 2018.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's why I brought it up.
Still makes me grind my teeth at night. They had
to fly to Washington for the one game and having to come back,
and then
in the middle of a homestand.
And then Madden used Strope as a pinch hitter, and then Strope strained his hamstring.
And he hurts himself.
In a game that, I mean, I actually advocated for them to stay home and forfeit that game. That was how extreme the travel ravages were already being inflicted on them. They had ended up reporting to the ballpark, and there were a couple of rainouts, but they were like rainouts after 2 hours of sitting in a clubhouse. They ended up reporting to a ballpark 42 out of 43 days to close out that season. That kind of brutality is impossible. They've fixed the schedule since then, so thanks. Can't fix that thing before the Cubs get to it, can you, MLB? But also just really difficult for any team to bear up under. So you got to take these moments when you get 3 weeks of very little travel and a couple of weird off days and rest up and make sure everyone's healthy and, on a rotation that they can sustain, because the rest of the way, you were just a buyer, but also you lag all these teams that you need to climb over by not even just a game or 2, 3 or 4 or 5. So you're going to have to finish at a sprint. So be ready for it.
And with that, we are going to wrap it up. We're going to call it a podcast. Pat, any final thoughts before we wrap it up?
I'm looking optimistically this week. It's a double steal week, right? You get 2 Justin Steele games. I think that puts him over the top. I think we head into the soft part of our schedule. Well, I guess the Mets, Blue Jays part of our schedule, with a real chance to be within striking distance of either the Brewers or the Reds. And you can't finish first until you get out of third. So the Brewers are struggling a little bit lately, and we can inflict some damage on the Reds head-to-head. So let's do it. And let's come back in a couple weeks. Well, I mean, we'll come back next week also, but in a couple weeks, let's let's pledge that the Cubs are at least in second place by then. How about that?
Sounds absolutely doable. And Matt Trueblood, thank you for coming on to talk Cubs with us, to help us break down all the trade deadline details. Once again, remind our listeners where they can find all your work on the internet.
Yeah, northsidebaseball.com. There are other places too, but that's the main one for anyone who's gotten this far into this particular podcast. Go there. We've got lots of good deadline coverage, and looking forward to August too.
It's extraordinarily trenchant analysis, and I highly recommend it to any Cubs fan. It's some of the best writing, if not the best writing, on the Cubs out there right now. So please give it a read.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And you can follow us on all the socials at Wrigleyville Nat for Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it. Instagram, Threads, we're everywhere at Wrigleyville Nat. Facebook.com/Wrigleyville Nation. And of course, we have a Patreon. That's how we stay ad-free for 5+ seasons now, because our great listeners continue to support us. Every single penny goes right back into the show. We pay for the hosting fees, microphones, all that stuff. We keep the domain names are not cheap. All that stuff is there, paid for, keeping us in the black thanks to our Patreon supporters. If you want to keep this show ad-free, you can support us as well at patreon.com/Wrigleyville Nation. And if you can't support the show financially in these times, we understand as well. Please rate, review, recommend the show, show a Cubs fan how to subscribe to the show. We rely on your word of mouth to continue to spread the word about the podcast. All the links I described, the entire back catalog of this podcast, everything is available at the website, WrigleyvilleNation.com. And with that, we are wrapping it up. Pat, thank you for joining us, and safe travels.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Thanks again, everyone, for listening, and we'll talk to you again next time.